two baby girls were born to Ren and Dana of Triton. The first of the children, Indra, was named after a woman many people believed to be a saint in the town of Triton. The Indra that their daughter got her namesake from passed away many years before Ren and Dana's time on Fenrir, but the stories of Indra were historic, legendary, and passed on from generation to generation. Despite the popularity of the person, the name was often not used to name children. Some considered it disrespectful to the saint, while others felt it would put too much pressure on the child to live up to the name. However, Dana was a woman that believed strongly in signs and fate. Having trouble deciding on the name for their first child, Ren and Dana picked a few, but couldn't agree on one. The day that Indra was born was full of complications. There were moments when Ren thought he would lose his wife during the child's birth, lose his child, or lose both. Ren feared the worst, but as if a miracle was performed by the gods and goddesses of Fenrir themselves, Indra was born healthy and Dana survived. So why did they choose the name Indra? It was actually due to a woman helping deliver the baby. A woman named Faye. When things looked their worst during the childbirth, Faye held Ren and Dana's hands for a moment to pray, and in her prayer she only mentioned one name. The name of the Saint Indra. It wasn't just this prayer that would go on to make Ren and Dana choose Faye's name for their second child. It was once again fate's interference when Faye showed up to also deliver their second child. When King Ingvar's men came to recruit members of Triton for their army, Indra was 12 and Faye was 10. Ren decided to take his family south to avoid the war entirely, planning to stop in Vorpal to restock supplies. Shortly after they arrived in Vorpal, rumors spread of Lord Kazai recruiting for the war in Vorpal and that King Ingvar was also on his way south to recruit as well. Ren sent his family to the next town over while he stayed behind to get them the supplies. Ren never joined them. On top of their father's absence and the lack of supplies they needed, the next town over from Vorpal was a town called Elmore. When Dana and the girls arrived, it was as if they entered a ghost town. Not a soul around, and buildings collapsed as if they had been burnt to the ground. Dana did not want to risk anything, so she took the girls east. She knew of one other kingdom not involved in the war, the kingdom of Ilfor. A journey east without supplies meant trouble for the three of them, and they almost didn't make it. Dana gave the remaining food to her children and could barely walk as they approached the gates. As she called out to the people of Ilfor, she collapsed. Indra and Faye were able to get the attention of the guards, and they were brought into Ilfor, where Dana was nursed back to health. The Knights of Ilfor and the king especially showed interest in Dana right away. The southernmost kingdom in Fenrir didn't have many visitors from the north, so the information Dana could provide was of great importance to them. Not to mention they experienced the beginning of King Ingvar and Lord Kazai's war firsthand on their travels. Dana and her children were given a place to stay, and Dana quickly found a place in the Ilfor kingdom, providing the king and his knights with information. But over time, Dana changed. She quickly became distant to her children, and after a while, Indra and Faye thought Dana had completely forgotten about them. She rarely came home, and often the children had to fend for themselves. One day, after not seeing their mother for weeks, she returned home only to give the girls the news that their father had been recruited by King Ingvar's obsidian army. The news alone was upsetting, but the mother standing before them was not what they remembered. Her eyes looked like she hadn't slept since they last saw her. She was much skinnier than they remembered, and when she hugged them, she felt cold to the touch. Indra could tell her sister was scared of their own mother, so Indra took it upon herself to question her mother's behavior and what she was really doing inside the castle. Dana danced around the question, the girls could tell, but she was saved from giving them a true answer by a knock on the door. The house never got visitors when the girls were alone, something that Indra and Faye were grateful for now given the circumstances. When the door opened, one of Ilfor's knights stood at the door. Indra and Faye had met this man in a previous encounter, shortly after Dana started working at the castle. They called him Hend, named after Henton, an old fishing town that was once Vorpal's rival and abandoned by the mermaid goddess Morska for its disloyalty to her. Indra and Faye talked to each other privately, discussing their uneasiness around Hend, and seeing him at their front door made them nervous. Hend told Dana it was time to go, and Dana smiled at the girls. She kissed them both on the forehead and left with Hend. Indra and Faye couldn't sit idly while their mother continued to work for these men in Ilford Castle. For the next 4 days, they pretended to play in parts of Ilford close to the castle. They monitored the nights, the rare sightings of their mother, and the even rarer sightings of the king. They picked up a lot of valuable information in the process. That not long ago, the king had turned his back on a goddess the girls had never heard of before. The daughter of Jakari and Morska, a goddess by the name of Tasfia. In doing so, Ilford fell on tough times, but the king continued to push to make it prosperous. He even went to great lengths to rid competition they could actually compete with, like the people of Elmore, a display that Indra and Faye had seen firsthand. Despite the gossip they overheard, no information was more important than the fact that the king of Ilford had commanded experiments on his own people being carried out in the dungeons of the castle. Fearing their mother was either being experimented on or taking part in the experiments on others, the children decided to get close to the dungeon on the 5th day. Learning the layout of the castle was something they were also working on during the 4 days beforehand. Using simple deduction, they were able to figure out which part of the castle likely had the dungeon. It was the least traveled by any of the knights, but they often saw Hend travel down a similar corridor every day. Seeing as the start of the war kept most eyes off Ilford and 2 small children would hardly be noticed, especially as threats, it was rather easy for Indra and Faye to sneak into the castle with the knowledge they had gained in the past few days. As they made their way to the dungeon, they came to an abrupt stop when they saw the king of Ilford and Hend talking outside the dungeon's doors. Beside them was a pile of bodies. Faye went to gasp, but Indra put her hand over her mouth to quiet her. After a few moments, the dungeon door opened. An Ilford knight carried out another body and threw it on the pile. "Another failure?" asked Hend. "Afraid so," replied the knight. "Expected," scoffed the king. "We are trying to do the impossible. Replicating the power of a goddess isn't going to be easy. Transferring the fragmented power of Tasfia left inside these amulets isn't something we're going to figure out in a day, or month, or year. But we must figure it out before the war is over." "There is one avenue we haven't tried yet," said Hend, "but you might not like it." "Go on," said the king. "The only one who has shown promise, well, the only one to survive the experiment so far, is the woman from Triton. Clearly, the gods and goddesses must favor her." Hend's words frightened the girls. Their suspicion that their mother was involved in these experiments was correct. "Not enough to transfer Tasfia's power," the king reminded him. "Yes, of course. Our research leads us to believe this woman of Triton may just be too old or just not strong enough." Hend's words forced Indra to grab Faye by the hand and go to rush out of the castle, but 2 Ilford knights stood in their way and forced them out into the corridor. Hend turned his attention to Indra and Faye, which caused the king of Ilford to turn his attention to them as well. "But perhaps her children are the ones we should consider using instead."